you know about the power of one. And the best example I can tell you about that is the story of Leon Sullivan and Nelson Mandela. How many know Nelson Mandela or know of Nelson Mandela? That's right. How many of you know of Leon Sullivan? There you go. See, you got it a little quiet. Well, let me tell you something about Nelson Mandela and Leon Sullivan, because there could be no Nelson Mandela without Leon Sullivan. Leon Sullivan has more statues in Africa to him than any other American, including Martin Luther King. But see, Leon Sullivan, we'll talk about him in a second, because I want to tell you about Nelson Mandela. Most of you know that he's out and he's the president and he's getting weaker. But what you don't know is when Mandela was put in prison, they kept him in prison for about 27 years, Dr. Stute, in solitary confinement. And what they would do is, they would say to him, if you would denounce the African National Congress, then what we will do for you is we will allow you to go free. We'll make your life better. But he wouldn't do it. So they kept him in solitary, and they would try to break him mentally. And what they would do is they would tell him that his mother was dying. Frank, that she wants to see you. They only allowed him one visitor a year, and his wife would come, and she would come to visit him. He said, how's mama doing? And he would say, she is sick, and she would like to see you, Nelson, and she would leave. They would say, you ready to go now? You ready to denounce the Congress? He couldn't do it. He wouldn't do it. And they would sit there and they would play tapes all night. I'll never forget, God has blessed me to be in a position where when I was in the palace, and I was listening to him in the presidential palace in Pretoria telling the story, President Mandela was saying how he used to sit there and they would play tapes of his mother's voice. No, son, please, no, son, I need you, please. And he would just start crying, but he didn't want him to hear him cry, coach. So he'd take his socks, he would take the sheet and he would stuff it in his mouth, and he'd just sit there all that night and he would cry. But he just said he could not let him break him. Ernie, he wouldn't let him break him. So he decided what he was going to do one day. Bob, he was just going to stare at the lock. Because, see, they would leave the door open because they wanted him to walk out so they could shoot him and say he tried to escape. He would call down the hall, you left the door open. Come shut the door, you left the door open. He would sit there and he said, because he didn't want to come out that way, he stood there and he started staring at the lock. And he said, one day with the power invested in me, I am going to get that door to open. Remember that. Remember the song in the poem Invictus where he said, no matter how straight the gate, no matter how charred the scroll, I, Bruce Harrell, am the captain of my soul. He said, I'm not going to give in to this. So he kept sitting there and he was looking at that lock. Put a pin in that and hold it there for a second, because there was a guy named Leon Sullivan, another guy in his own right. See, in the 60s, I was one of these Stokely Carmichael, let's burn it down, baby. We need to tear this thing up. We ain't going to do it, Paul. We going to come out the hard way, Mary Pugh. And Leon Sullivan was this business guy, this black guy who was the first black member of the board of directors of a major Fortune 500 company. And Phil, he was on General Motors board. And so I thought he was Uncle Tom. That's what I call him. You know, why ain't you protesting? Why ain't you burning some stuff down? Well, he didn't do it that way. He was on the board. What I didn't know until 30 years later, sitting on the tarmac in Zimbabwe with Dr. Sullivan, he told me the story of what happened. Dr. Sullivan said that he was on the board of General Motors. He was trying to talk them into divesting all of their goods in South Africa, because if you could get them to divest their goods, Martha, then maybe it would put pressure on the government, and Pretoria and F.W. de Klerk would give up apartheid. So he started doing this, but they said at General Motors, we got billions and billions of dollars, Lonnie, in South Africa. We ain't giving up these billions. Leon, I tell you what, it's different. It's different than you think. Come on over to South Africa and let us show you. So he gets on this private jet. He flies over there, Miss Hollingsworth, and he starts walking around the plant. And it's different. In there, whites are working with blacks, and blacks are playing, and their kids are together, Debbie, in the playground and in the lunchroom and all that. They said, see, Leon, I told you. You were wrong. Bill, he said, maybe I was wrong. Maybe things are changing. Maybe we don't need to divest. He said, no, you don't need to divest. You need to put more money, Nick. Put more in here, more investment. He starts thinking to himself, maybe it's wrong. So they get back in the limo. They drive out to the airport, and they're coming through the airport. And as they get to the airport, Dr. Sullivan said he looks up and he saw a guard that made a funny looking move, and he signaled to somebody. And right when he was coming through, one of the guards put a gun in his face. He said, you out of line. chairman of General Motors said, excuse me, that he's with me. He said, you get away from here, Kaffa boy, you Kaffa lover. That means nigger in South Afrikaans. He said, you get away. He said, we want you to strip. He said, but I'm on the board of General Motors. He said, you strip right there. Dr. Sullivan began to take his clothes off. He began to strip. And anybody who knew Leon Sullivan, he's a big man, Robert, 6'9", proud man. He starts taking his clothes off. He takes them off. Not like the TSA and they let you go behind the curtain. Right out there in front of God and everybody, he had to take his clothes off. So he takes his clothes off right there in front of everybody. He gets down to his shorts. And the man looks at him, and instead of letting him go, when everybody's walking around him looking, coach, he looked at him and he said, take it all off. The young boy that had the gun in his face, Frank, he said, sir, I'm sorry, but because now this boy is starting to change. He's 22, 23 years old, and he sees this proud man standing in front who he knows has done nothing wrong. And as he's sitting there watching him, he said, sir, I'm sorry. You see what Dr. King said? Love transforms. Nonviolence transforms. He sat there and he didn't make a move against him, but it transformed that guy who just called him a Kaffa 5 minutes earlier. He said, sir, I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to ask you to take your shorts off. I must do this to you. And Dr. Sullivan looks at him. He says, you go ahead and do to me today what you must do to me. Because, Greg, when I get back to my country, the United States of America, I will do to your country what I must do to them. He sat there and he looked up at this guy and he took his shirt, stuck him in, and he pulled him down to the ground. He stood there in all of his nakedness and looked around as everybody stared at him. And they thought for a minute that he was going to put his clothes on. They said, now you can go. He looked up at the man because, see, what the man didn't want to do is see his nakedness. He wanted to see his dignity stripped. But Dr. Sullivan wouldn't give it up. Oh, no, a leader never gives up their dignity. Not in the middle of challenge, not in the middle of struggle. A leader stands strong, stands straight. Dr. Sullivan grabbed his clothes and he walked right through the airport. They said, put your clothes on. He said, I'm not putting them on. He walked back out to the airport holding them naked. He sat down on the plane. FG-4 sitting up there ready to fly in this private plane. Complete silence on the plane. Sam, they didn't know what to do. Chairman of General Motors, the vice president, who's going to say something to him? And he didn't make it any better or worse. He kept his clothes off. He's sitting in the seat naked. Finally, the chairman, you the chairman? Chairman said, Leon, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. He said, you see what I told you? It's great when you're inside of that gate, but if you're not living in that plant, this is what black people go through in South Africa every day. He said, what can I do, Leon? He said, you can only do one thing for me. You can pick up that phone and call the President of the United States, as I've seen you do so many times, Randy. I want you to call him, Senator Fleming. I want you to call the President and say that General Motors is going to pull out, and you're encouraging you remember Senator Fleming. Senator Fleming started one of our first divestiture bills in this state. He called George Fleming and he called others and said, we need to pull out of South Africa. All of our universities, all of our colleges, all of our businesses, all of the government entities, pull out of South Africa and divest in them. They started doing it, and they started going around the country. Oh, wait a minute. Remember Nelson Mandela? Remember that guy, the power of one leaders? Remember how he stared at that deal? He didn't know Leon Sullivan, but Leon Sullivan knew him. And when he put the pressure on South Africa, when he walked out of that gate, when Leslie and I stayed up that night at 4 in the morning Seattle time, when Nelson and Winnie came out of that gate with their hand raised to get into the car, not one person had a dry eye because they understood what had just happened. What leadership had just happened. No white people were driven into the sea. No riots happened. No race wars took place. Nelson Mandela took over as president. Though you may just charge me, no, he said, I am the captain of my soul. When he got out, when he and Leon Sullivan got together, it showed what two leaders can do. And it shows you what the power of one can do. If you really, really decide that you want to make a difference. And I know some of the stuff that you're doing, and there's some of you that are already making a difference.